There are five distinct levels to nonprofits. And since 1970, more than 200,000 of them have been founded right here in the United States. Only 144 ever reached 50 million in annual revenue. If you're working in this sector, raising money, leading a team, trying to figure out why growth feels so hard, that number is the context for everything. The nonprofit sector employs 12.5 million people. It generates 3.7 trillion in annual revenue. And it's the third largest employer in the country, ahead of manufacturing. And yet 97% of nonprofits operate with budgets under $5 million. The money exists, the mission exists, but something is breaking down between here and there. And it's not passion, and it's not effort. In this video, I'm going to show you exactly what it is. We're going to walk through five distinct levels of nonprofit growth. What runs each one? What kills most organizations at each stage, and what the few that actually scaled did differently. If you've hit a ceiling and you can't name why, this framework will name it for you. Level 1, the startup, which is from 0 to 50K. Every nonprofit in this sector started here. A person, a cause, a credit card. At this level, the organization is not really an organization yet, right? It's a person with a mission, and the revenue reflects that completely. The primary funding engine is the founder's personal network and personal story. Donations come from friends, family, former colleagues, and anyone the founder can reach directly. If the founder gets sick, burnt out, or runs out of steam, the money simply stops. And that's not a startup risk. That is the operating model. The financial distortion at this level is subtle but important. Most founders don't pay themselves, so overhead looks like zero, right? The cost per dollar raised appears almost perfectly efficient. But when you account for the 60-hour weeks or more, the personal credit cards, and all the unpaid labor, the actual cost per dollar raised is often the highest in the entire sector. They look like the most efficient fundraisers. They are often the least. The behavioral trap is confusing activity with strategy. Bake sales, peer-to-peer campaigns, social media posts, these feel like fundraising. They produce revenue once because they're novel, but they don't build anything repeatable. Every dollar requires the same heroic effort as the first dollar. There's a pattern worth naming here. Early in a fundraising career, it's easy to equate growing a contact list and having more meetings with actual progress. In reality, you can spend years building relationships without a strategy or even a system in place. Without those, relationships almost never close into sustained funding. The existential risk at level 1 is not financial failure, it's founder burnout. This is the level where the mission eats the person alive, and when they disappear, so does everything they built. The milestone that actually matters here is not raising more money. It's building one repeatable donor relationship that exists independently of your personal effort. Revenue that survives your absence. That's when you have an organization. Level 2, the local hero, 50 to 250K. This is where 88% of nonprofits spend most of their lives. The organization is legible now. There's a logo, maybe a part-time staff person, local recognition, and they've discovered the gala. The gala is the defining trap of level 2. Here's the math most organizations never do. You spent $20,000 to run an event. You gross 30,000. You tell everyone you made 30,000. But after costs, you netted 10,000 and you spent hundreds of staff hours to do it, right? So when you calculate the true cost of the staff time, events at this level frequently break even, and actually they usually lose money. The gala isn't wrong, but treating it as a funding strategy rather than a community visibility tool is where organizations get stuck. The number that explains level 2 better than anything else in the new donor retention rate, sector-wide, it sits near 14%. That means roughly 7 out of every 8 new donors will never give again. Most organizations at this level celebrate acquiring a new donor. They should be alarmed at the 7 they just lost, right? The psychological trap is that acquisition feels like growth. Every new donor feels like forward movement. Retention is invisible. until the math stops working and no one can explain why revenue feels so hard to sustain. So here's what actually happens inside development teams stuck at level 2. Ask them what they're working on, and they'll say they're working on strategy, major gifts, and partnerships. And watch what they're actually doing. It's email blasts, event planning, grant scrambles, and lapsed donor outreach. So almost no time on building systems, almost no time on forecasting, almost no time on understanding what kind of funder they're actually built to serve. So the leaky bucket does not get fixed by pouring in more water. Scale at this level is mathematically impossible until second gifts are more reliable than first gifts. Stabilize retention before you scale acquisition. That's the only exit. Level 3, the growth engine from 250 to 1.5 million US dollars. This is the fork in the road. Only 3% of nonprofits ever cross 5 million in revenue. Most of the organizations that don't make it get stopped right here. Level 3 is where organizations hire their first real development professional, start pursuing foundation grants, and begin experiencing something that quietly derails them: mission drift. Mission drift is what happens when an organization starts chasing grant money for programs it doesn't actually want to run because those programs match what foundations are currently funding. The grant starts determining the program, not the mission. That's a slow, bureaucratic way to lose the thing that made the organization worth funding in the first place. The financial tension at level 3 is specific and underappreciated. An organization can appear fully funded on paper while being unable to actually make payroll. And the reason is restricted revenue. Restricted money can only be used for the program it was designed for. It cannot cover salaries, operations, or anything else that's not specifically for the program. Organizations at this level are frequently rich in restricted dollars and desperate for unrestricted cash. And the leaders miss it because they look at total committed dollars instead of what's actually available to spend today. The first question to ask is always, how much unrestricted money do we have right now? Not total commitments, not total grants, actual unrestricted cash available today. Now, here's the funding that contradicts almost everything taught at nonprofit conferences. Every consultant, every webinar, every sector publication tells organizations to diversify their revenue streams. The data says the opposite. Bridgespan studied every nonprofit that reached 50 million or more in annual revenue. Over 90% of them raised the bulk of their money from one single funding category, not a mix, one: government or foundations or individuals or corporate, one dominant source. But of course, there wasn't a shift in the market at that point. Here's why that matters. Every funding type requires a completely compelling different organization to pursue it. Government contracts need compliance teams, cost accounting, and political navigation. Foundation grants need program officer relationships and specialized writing, and major donors need years of personalized cultivation. Corporate partners need business case storytelling, not mission storytelling. Trying to build all four simultaneously at a $500,000 a year organization means doing none of them well. The organizations that have watched 5 diversified revenue streams fail while competitors scale by mastering one primary engine first, they're not outliers. They're the pattern. Diversification before dominance doesn't reduce risk. It spreads weakness. When organizations hear this and push back, the resistance almost always sounds the same. We don't want to be dependent on one source. What that actually means almost every time is that they're afraid to make a strategic choice and be wrong. Dependence is the stated fear. Commitment is the real one. The walk away at level 3 is to choose a dominant funding category and build the infrastructure around it before adding complexity. Not after, but before you add complexity. Level 4, the regional power, 1.5 million to 20 million US dollars per year. By this stage, the organization looks successful from the outside: a full development team, multi-year pledges, government contracts, high net worth donor relationships, and it's more fragile than it has ever been. Two things are happening simultaneously at level 4 that leaders often don't see until it's too late. The first is liquidity. Government contracts are the primary funding engine at this level, but government contracts reimburse slowly. You do the work first, the government pays you months later, and without 3 to 6 months of operating expenses and cash reserves, you can't sustain yourself with those contracts. According to the Nonprofit Finance Fund's 2025 survey, 52% of nonprofits have 3 months or fewer in cash reserves. That's scary. Many have far less. Here's what that looks like in practice. A funder was ready to commit a major grant to an organization, right? Before signing, they asked one question: how long can you operate if this grant is delayed? And the answer was 30 days. That answer nearly ended the deal. The organization had to pause fundraising activity, rebuild cash reserves, and return months later before the funder would proceed. And the funder didn't need to see more passion. They needed to see sustainability. Serious funders at this level have stopped asking why. They assume you care about the mission. What they need to see is whether you have a credible execution plan. The plan is the filter, not the passion. The second fragility at level 4 is concentration. 2 or 3 major donors can represent 30 to 40% of total revenue. These donors are human beings. They age, their priorities shift, their financial situations change, their children do not always share their values, and organizations that built funding models around 3 relationships didn't build a model. They built a friendship, and they have 90 days of cash if that friendship ends. Days cash on hand is the single most important number most development directors are not tracking. If reserves are thin, do not expand contracts. Liquidity determines whether you survive long enough to actually matter. Level 5, the platform organization. That's 20 million US dollars or above. This is where the Red Cross operates. The United Way, the YMCA, Habitat for Humanity, they all operate at this level. Fundraising at this level is essentially a different profession. Endowment management, capital campaigns, planned giving programs, brand management across thousands of employees. The defining risk at level 5 is not financial, it's reputational. One investigative news story can erase millions in donations almost overnight. In 2016, media coverage of alleged excessive spending at the Wounded Warrior Project led to immediate donor defection. The CEO resigned, revenue collapsed, not because the organization stopped doing its work, because the story changed. The overhead ratio is the metric most associated with this level, and it's the most misunderstood number in the entire sector. For decades, donors and watchdog organizations treated low overhead as proof of virtue. The lower the better. Charity Navigator built its entire rating system around it, right? But academic research has since shown that the optimal overhead ratio for nonprofit effectiveness is around 35 to 43%, not 15%, not 10% like the foundations usually pay, 35 to 43%. Below that threshold, every dollar cut from overhead reduces program effectiveness. The organization isn't saving money, it's destroying capacity. And there's a belief that persists across every level of the sector that low overhead equals excellence. Experience corrects it eventually. Underinvesting in systems, finance, and development infrastructure is one of the fastest ways to stall an organization. Strong infrastructure is not waste, it is leverage. And here is the moment that makes this concrete. In a funder meeting, a senior funder asked one question: which part of the model actually scales? And the room went quiet. The organization had stories, passion, and programs, but no one had put pen to paper to project when or how the model would scale. No growth engine, no numbers, no answer. One question literally exposed everything. The walkaway at level 5 is that brand and governance are as mission critical as programs, and underinvesting in infrastructure at scale is not frugality, it is completely catastrophic for many nonprofits. Now, what does this mean if you actually want to survive as a nonprofit? Let's step back from the levels for a moment. 200,000 nonprofits have been founded since 1970. 144 reached 50 million. 97% operate under 5 million. In early 2025, a third of nonprofits reported funding disruptions from federal, state, or local government sources. And 61% said they felt at moderate to significant risk of being able to continue operating at all. This is not abstract. This is the environment that we're currently operating in. So, what the 144 actually do differently? Three things appear consistently. First, they concentrated. Over 90% of nonprofits that scaled significantly raised the majority of their funding from one dominant category. They did not try to run all of their donor funding types at once. They picked the one they could build a machine around, and they built it. Second, they invested in overhead and systems capacity before they felt they could afford not to. They did not starve infrastructure to look efficient. They treated infrastructure as the investment that made everything else work. Third, they built retention or funding concentration before expanding complexity. They stabilized the base, then they scaled. The strategic implication is uncomfortable but clear. Growth is statistically rare and structurally fragile. Diversifying too early traps organizations in paramount mid-level stagnation. Enough revenue to feel like progress, not enough infrastructure to break through. And the goal is not always the next level. It's mastering the constraint of the level you're actually at. If your retention's broken, you don't have a fundraising problem. You have a stewardship problem. And if you're chasing 5 revenue types at $600,000 in revenue, you don't have a strategy problem. You have a focus problem. If 3 donors represent 40% of your revenue, you don't have a growth problem. You have a concentration problem. The framework doesn't guarantee you reach level 5, but it tells you which problem you actually have right now and which lever is worth pulling. That's the only place to start. If you run an organization between $200,000 and $2 million a year, the question we're sitting with after this video is not how do we get to the next level? It's what's the actual constraint at the level we're already at. The organizations that answered that question clearly and resisted the pressure to grow before they were durable are the ones that eventually had something real to scale. The question that follows from here is harder. Once you've identified your dominant funding source and started building around it, how do you actually activate the right funders, build those relationships, and structure a pitch that moves serious donors from interested to committed? That's the next part of this. If this framework was useful, the next video takes you inside the mechanics of what actually closes funding at levels 3 and 4, where most of the sector is stuck and where the decisions matter the absolute most.